Yes, the CGTF, which is the Corporate Tax Governance Framework, is already out there in the website of the Inland Revenue Board, right? And has been promoted in some ways, and the issue here is about understanding what that framework requires. And we need to appreciate that the framework is aimed at the larger taxpayers, corporate taxpayers, who have got a better system of control, internal controls and so on, and maybe perhaps can improve on the governance aspect of how the tax function is managed in their organization. So as far as a profession is concerned, right now the framework is going through a pilot testing, and as we know, there are about 12 corporates who are participating in the pilot testing. After this is done, I believe that the Inland Revenue Board will issue perhaps some amendment or revised framework, because from their learnings from this particular pilot, they can improve their particular framework, hopefully. And once that framework is then improved and finalized, you then have the opportunity of all taxpayers who are interested may want to come forward and be part of this cooperative compliance framework. So, but it requires you to have better structure, better governance, better internal controls as far as managing the tax information is concerned in your organization. So there will be some work to do for some of the smaller entities. They may need to have better documentation, better governance processes, and structured way of how they do things. And I think many people know how to do things, but it perhaps may not have been structured in terms of policies, guidelines, which then an outside body can read and appreciate that you actually have your tax function is managed in a more effective manner. So this is of benefit to corporates, and it's just a question of whether one wants to participate or not. Participation here simply means you are engaging in a situation where there's trust between the tax authorities and the corporation that you are in, right? Trust in the sense that you're willing to share some of the information that you have, and Inland Revenue Board officers probably will be willing to be more friendlier to you and more accessible. And so that in the end of the day, there is an element of tax certainty that we want. Let me explain that a little bit. When you are in the cooperative compliance initiative, and let's say you graduated as a member, what this means is that the tax authorities are willing to treat you on a different level as a entity that they can trust. And you will have an account manager allocated to you within the Revenue Board. And this is the person who will then probably try to learn more about your industry. And this is a person that you can then call if there are some complex tax issues for which there is some uncertainty in the treatment for tax purposes. Clarity and all the interpretation is always a challenge in tax, right? So you can then call this account manager and discuss matters, and you may get an idea about how you should be treated. So that is what we mean by tax certainty, so that a corporate knows this is the way the Inland Revenue thinks about it, and this is then the way we will carry out the transaction and document it. So then you have certainty on day one. So that when you file your tax return, you're filing it in an accurate manner. And so that to me is a great advantage to especially large entities which do get involved in very complex tax transactions and so on and so forth. So that's one benefit. The other benefit sometimes is about the fact that you may come across a previous year that you have already filed, but you find there was an error made and it surfaces, and you then wish to file a revised tax return. And you may have no penalties imposed because you are in this particular framework, or you may have much lower penalties imposed. So that's the objective. So there's an element of trust, and therefore that your system is functioning well and you're reporting your tax liabilities properly. So therefore, the inland revenue is willing to give you some benefits. But one thing that the tax authorities in Malaysia have not done is to promise you that if you graduate into the cooperative compliance framework, I mean you are a member of this particular framework, can they promise you that you will not be audited over a period of time? In some countries like the Netherlands and so on, there is a promise that you will not be audited, let's say, for 5 years. So you will not have a tax audit come at your door, right? And therefore, that's what trust is all about. So I'm hoping that the inland revenue will consider this particular issue of trying to say, let's promise you that once we are comfortable with your system of internal controls, and you graduate into my cooperative compliance program, I promise you that there will be no tax audit for 5 years. But I'll be happy to help you if you have any uncertainties, clarifications, and so on and so forth. So that's what I'm hoping that the Malaysian framework will progress into in due course. Now, as far as this 2023 MIA International Conference is concerned, the topics that we have lined up for the 2 days actually are very topical, relevant, and current. Obviously, the challenge we always have is trying to get a good set of speakers or panelists. And I know MIA tries hard, as it does, but there are sometimes difficulties in getting the right speakers or panelists. So I think we've managed to do justice in a number of sessions, but perhaps in some other sessions I find that the focus of the way in which the topic was presented or managed, perhaps by the moderator as well as perhaps the panelists, perhaps could be improved better. Because there are some situations, some forums where I find provocative statements being made by panelists, but yet the moderator doesn't take it up. And that could have been a very interesting discussion if you had these provocative statements then taken up and say, what do you mean? And let's look more into it. So the sessions can actually be much more useful and productive. But overall, I think the conference, as always, meets most of our requirements and has been actually very good because it's good for networking. And I, for one, have met so many of my ex-students the days when I was an academic, and even met some of my ex-university mates today, which I've never had the occasion to in past MIA events. So I'm wondering whether this MIA event attracted more people than before, because we haven't had physical events. So overall, very good. And I also find that some of the panelists and speakers, we don't have as many luminaries as we used to have, and perhaps that's because we are used to having luminaries, but do we really need all of them? I'm not sure. Maybe you're looking at the second liners and people who are coming up and building up your particular portfolio of future speakers. So good and bad, but I think that my only point is that some of the sessions could be managed better. And sometimes it's also because perhaps the moderators, I suppose, who you choose as a moderator. We have used a number of anchors from Astro Awani. One of them is excellent, the rest I'm not sure. And I think they have qualities in terms of being able to manage, but they also have lead up on the topic, but because they are not really conversant in the topic areas, it does create issues in terms of how they're going to carry out that subsequent conversation. So maybe we should try harder getting some practitioners or even some ex-practitioners who are still active, who are willing to perhaps moderate such events in future, may be helpful for us.